Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to 2021. Unbelievably, this is our first Agave sessions of the new year. Thank you, everybody who is tuning in with us amid just all the craziness that is going on in the world. Hopefully, we can provide at least an hour-long respite from that. Really excited for my conversation today. It's not too often that I get a little bit nervous before talking to people on this program. It's usually because I'm very good friends and have a lot of interactions with my guests. But this afternoon, I was lucky enough to connect with somebody whose work I've been a very big fan of for several years. And you've heard me mention him before on the program. And he does, I think, he tells some of the most interesting visual stories from Oaxaca and other parts of Mexico. And just kind of the way he's run his other projects over the years has always been something that I find very admirable and really inspirational, and it's kind of given me some perspective on how I want to talk about Mezcal and Agave spirits and cultures throughout Mexico. And you've heard me mention one of his books before, The Wonderful Fire and Clay, The Art of Oaxacan Pottery. So this afternoon, I'm lucky enough to be joined by photographer Eric Mindling. Eric, are you there, my friend? Coming along. There he is. We see him. There we go. And now we can hear him.
Okay. Technological connection is made.
Hey, man, as long as there's a connection, you know?
Right on.
How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. That warms my heart. It feels so good to be appreciated for the work I've done, and I hear that appreciation in you. Thank you for that. Happy to be here and ready to talk. And I love what you say. Let's take a respite for an hour and talk about things that don't have to do with what's going on in the outside world around us right now.
Yeah, man, and maybe can just, that's one of the reasons I'm really excited that I got this avenue, because, you and I, like I said, we only connected recently, but I've been really lucky in that this program has allowed me to take Agave spirits and then expand into so many different adjacent arenas with this, whether it be biodiversity, conservation, other parts of culture. I've just been really lucky with the people that I've been able to come on and speak with me. So that's why I'm really excited about this afternoon. We're going to talk about photography. We're going to talk about textiles. We're going to talk about ceramics, just really things that I absolutely adore about the places that we get to work in, and that I think people might not be as familiar with as they are with Agave spirit. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to start this program. So today is really the epitome of what I had in mind. So I'm really excited. I'm going to do very quickly, just kind of hit the highlights. Really, Eric, you're obviously a photographer, is how you're mainly making your way right now. You've focused. You've been a ceramics buyer. You've done 2 books, one on textiles, one on ceramics of Mexico, particularly Oaxaca. You led Traditions Mexico, which was leading really wonderful cultural tours in, I believe, Oaxaca and Chiapas and Michoacan.
Right.
And obviously, I think we've crossed paths, or we have people that we've both crossed paths with in Oaxaca. Ana Fuentes is one person who comes to mind. I know she did a lot of work with you. I've been lucky enough to meet her a couple times in Oaxaca, and she does really wonderful photography herself. But for those who don't know, I would love it if you could just give us a little bit of an intro of kind of, I know that you're transitioning right now, as we just mentioned, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about your work, what you did when you were living in Oaxaca, and how you wound up there and how you decided to pursue that particular avenue.
Yeah, and try to keep that in under an hour.
I know, right?
I first went to Oaxaca when I was a student in 1989 or 90, studying Spanish. I didn't speak much Spanish, and I didn't know how to say the word Oaxaca. And University, Humboldt State in California, offered a semester abroad, and I was dying to spend time anywhere else. And this semester in a place that I learned to pronounce as Oaxaca opened my eyes to a world that I'd been dreaming of. I'd been dreaming of it here in my heart. And I was 19 then, I think. And as far back as I can remember, there's been a certain kind of yearning inside of me, or a call towards something different than the world that I grew up in. which is the Western United States, looking for something that at that point I didn't have words for. And now I do, which is a sense of belonging, a sense of rootedness, a sense of community. And none of that really did I have. So when I arrive in Oaxaca in 1989 or 90, I find this. At the same time, I'm studying pottery, I'm studying art, and in university, I start meeting potters in Oaxaca who have been doing pottery as part of the way they make a living for 200 generations. I didn't even know such things existed. So this introduces me to this place called Oaxaca, and it gives me a sense of what Mexico is. And it completely blew all the ideas I had of what Mexico was. I mean, I grew up in the Western United States, and we have, I grew up around a lot of stereotypes about Mexico that are, very superficial and very cliche. And it was such a relief to start to release those stereotypes and see what this real world was. I eventually, I'll keep this short. I eventually wound up going back to Oaxaca to live in 1992, hired by a store in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I am currently living, to be their pottery buyer. And this was a job made in heaven for me. How that aligned with my trajectory in life has got to be some kind of cosmic intervention, because there was one job like that on earth, and I wound up with that job. And off I went to Oaxaca to be a pottery buyer. And being a pottery buyer in Oaxaca means traveling around to rural indigenous communities, meeting traditional potters, getting to know them, making deals about buying the pottery. In some ways not different than, or maybe very similar to what you guys are doing with Mezcal. It's traveling down dirt roads, sourcing, creating relationships, and then finding a market for that product. And so this put me into this ancient world, and I couldn't have been more happy. And that job as a pottery exporter, which lasted about a decade, also put me into all these rural communities. And so this leads me to, I developed all sorts of beautiful relationships out of that, in one after another, after another, after another village. And I learned to speak, what I call Oaxacan. And Oaxacan is Spanish, but it's a certain way that you speak. It's a cultural language. It's how you approach a subject. It's how quickly you speak. It's the kind of humor you use. And I just learned that by hanging out with a lot of old-time rural people. And speaking a language and going in there with great curiosity opens doors. And so I built friendships, I built relationships. And at a certain point, this was 1996, I make this decision to start bringing other people out on these journeys with me to these rural villages. And that's how I start doing the tour business that became Traditions Mexico, focused on taking small groups of people out into small indigenous villages and focusing on the traditional arts that exist there, the old trades, los oficios, as we call them in Mexico, pottery, food making, textiles, in some cases distilling, pulque production, the creation of the things that are beautifully and anciently made to keep us alive. And so I made trips focused around those themes. And I did that as mostly my day job until April of last year. And COVID brought an end to tourism as being a viable way of doing things, of making a living. And I abruptly made the decision to close that down. I have also been a photographer, as you mentioned, Francisco. I grew up with my father as a photographer and started taking it seriously maybe 15 years ago. And I have very much focused my lens on the same things I just described in my tourism, on the things that have called my heart, which is rooted people, old ways of being, the kind of generational wisdom that is passed down from mother to daughter in humanity that didn't get passed on to us in the Western United States very well. And I'm finding it in Mexico. So these people who are my role models, who I have worked with for all these years, also become the subject of the photography, the pictures I take. And I think that answered your question. I don't know, what am I missing there? That's a broad overview of what brings me to here.
I think that was perfect, actually. That I think it kind of sets the stage for us to kind of touch on some of the topics that we had mentioned, that we had mentioned before. And you touched on it a couple times in your intro, kind of the things that you, and I watched some of your other, I think the TEDx talk that you did at Fashion Institute and stuff like that. where you kind of talk about things that you saw as lacking, but you in American culture or in the Western United States or what have you, is it a broader connection than just a connection to a sense of place that you were looking for? Is it a mixture of a physical geographic connection along with a cultural historic connection? Is it kind of that full circle, or what is it that you really felt or that you really found that really inspired you to go down that rabbit hole a little bit more of spending time in these traditional cultures?
There's different ways that I try to describe it. And in that TEDx talk you reference, I use a metaphor of sagebrush and tumbleweed. And in the Western United States in Nevada, where I grew up, sagebrush is a native plant that grows everywhere. And the land is scented with this sagebrush. And it's sort of an a faded green plant, a sturdy desert plant with roots that go deep into the soil and capture the moisture, survive the long dry summers, hold on through the winters, and has been there forever. And I was born in this land of sagebrush. And tumbleweed is a plant that actually apparently comes from Russia. There are a variety of types of tumbleweeds. It's an introduced plant. And if you're familiar with tumbleweeds from any Western movie, or if you live in the West, they're plants that grow. They have spines on them. They grow, and at a certain point in the life cycle of a tumbleweed, where the trunk connects to the roots in the ground, right at the soil, the wind blows and it breaks off. It breaks off and it starts tumbling, and it starts traveling on, and that's how it spreads its seeds. And the roots are left behind as it heads on. And I have thought of myself as a tumbleweed born in the land of sagebrush, and I think that most of us in the West and most of us in the United States are tumbleweeds, in that we are from someplace else and we have landed here and we go on to another place. I was born in one place, I went to school in another place, I lived in another place, my mother was from one place, and then I was born, it's like we're dispersed. And as I say in that TEDx talk, as I blew away, fulfilling my destiny as a Western tumbleweed, I look around and what I see are sagebrush all around me, staying in place, rooted to the ground, connected to that specific place on earth that they're from, knowing how the wind blows through the valleys, knowing what the early summer rains feel like, having a sense of which kind of creatures come around, knowing the birds. And so this is a metaphor that kind of speaks to what I think of as a certain emptiness that I was born with inside of me, and I think probably many of us, which is that we're not quite sure where on earth we belong. Yes, I'm from Nevada, and I love that connection to that physical place, and we're not quite sure what society we're part of. Yes, I'm part of the United States, but I didn't learn stories from my grandmother. I don't know the way my community works at a deeper level. I'm not really invested in my community because I'm going to move on to another place, because I'm going to go to school and then I'm going to get a job here. We exist in a certain kind of way and thrive in this world that is the land that I grew up in. But at the same time, I have felt like something's missing, and that something missing is a sense of ground, and it's a sense of what would it feel like to have roots that go into that ground for generations. What would it be like to be from a place where your parents are from, your grandparents are from, your great-grandparents are from, where you know all the stories, all the human stories, all the animal stories, you know the cycles of nature. And to answer that question, which I have no idea what that's like, because it's not my life experience, I've gone and spent time with people who know that innately, because they are that story, right? The people of places like indigenous rural Mexico are those sagebrushes. There are people who have been there for countless generations, who know all the stories of the land, and who also carry forward, and for me, this is one of the most important things, generational knowledge, very quiet, inherited generational knowledge about how to be human. And we all have this, right? We all know how to be human. I think there are ways of being human that are more enriching to our heart, that are more enriching to our soul, that are more conducive to our well-being. And there are some of those that come from my inheritance in a society, And there are a whole lot that I feel like that I didn't have as a gift of my birth and a gift of my cultural lineage. So this is a lot of words to describe what was just an impulse as a young man that pulled me towards a place different than the one I was born. And that was being pulled towards the place of, to use the metaphor, the rooted sagebrush, pulled towards a place where human beings carry forward and haven't lost connection with old human knowledge, old understandings of just how to walk on this earth. And so the potters of Oaxaca, without meaning to be so, have been incredible instructors for me. The weavers of Oaxaca, the rural farmers, the Mezcal distillers, the people who carry forth the old time ways, just know this and they live it out. So I hope that answered that question. I've already forgotten what it was, but I feel like I might have gotten there.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think it does a wonderful illustration of why these traditional ways are, at least for people who see them from the outside, right? And, I talk about this a lot in these conversations because the overwhelming majority of the people that I have on are people who are finding their own space in these arenas, but are not originally from those places, right? And we're all just kind of passing through these cultures, passing through these modes of existence as voyeurs to a certain extent, right? So for everybody watching, always remember that, take everything that we're saying, both Eric and myself, with a grain of salt, right? We can only speak to our own experiences being on the ground, but also completely as outsiders, right? But I think for a lot of people that get that fall in love with Mezcal, that fall in love with any kind of the ways that make up culture, whether that be food ways, whether that be beverage, whether that be ceramics, whether that be textiles, that they fall into that. I think to a certain extent, a lot of us are all looking for that connection, right? And I've talked about it before on this program with people in that, my experience traveling throughout Mexico, working with agave spirits, seeing those same connections that you just spoke about, definitely gave me the drive to connect more with my home, as we just talked about in Southern Arizona, because I think that was something that I took for granted, and it took me leaving that place to really appreciate what I had there, right? And I mean, I was born in DC, but my family but I was there like 6 months old, right, when I moved back to Arizona. So my family has connections in Arizona and the Altar Valley and in northern Sonora that do go back like 4 or 5 generations, right? And that was something that I really, really took for granted until I had moved away and lived in Texas and lived in the East Coast, lived in Mexico. And I feel very fortunate enough to have lived in those different environments, how different the connections are to that place for people that live in Texas or people that live in New York, right? Which is obviously a very transitory city for a lot of people. And then actually being in Southern Mexico and seeing those connections that you just spoke about, and then realizing that I actually have a place where I'm very lucky to have that connection. And then because I had a certain void within myself at that young age, didn't realize that. And now I'm very eagerly looking forward to returning to that place in a few months, whether it be temporary or long-term. But again, it wasn't really until I was in Mexico and saw the people that had those connections to that place, right? So I definitely 100% feel like, or at least I totally understand what it is that you're saying that you saw when you're down there. And I think that's one of the reasons that people, again, fall so in love so much with Mezcal, for example, right? Let's take that particular example, agave sessions, is because, we're all coming from these large metropolitan cities, this very different pace of life. And it's that what's in this bottle, right, is just one little vehicle into, if not making our own connections with that kind of, with that multi-generational existence, at least we can see it, at least we can touch it, even if it's not our own. And that seems to be a very profound connection for people, right? But one of the things that I kind of lament is that people connect with with agave spirits for that reason. But sometimes I feel like the thought about why they like it doesn't, at least from my own personal perspective, doesn't quite go deep enough, right? They get too focused on the mezcal, and are too focused on trying 800 different mezcals from all these different places, but might not necessarily take time to think about the culinary differences and why red meat is so much more prevalent in the northern part of Mexico, and given the colonial history and the geographic history of these places versus southern Oaxaca or versus southern Mexico, right? And the same thing goes for textiles, for example. I have past experience working and starting a rum brand from Mexico as well that operates in the very northern reaches of Oaxaca and the Mazateca. And then, realizing how different the textiles and how beautiful and vibrant they are, not that the ones obviously in southern Oaxaca aren't, but just how different they are. And the language and the culture is so much different, right? And that's something that people talk about when they talk about agave spirits, but I feel like they talk about it almost in passing and then immediately want to get back to the agave spirits again. Right. And that's really why I like your work, is because it seems to have a wider scope, and now it's visually, which is wonderful. But, you've spent a lot of, and if you go to I encourage people, although Traditions has closed down, I think you've put a lot of time and thought into the blog portion of it and just talking and reflecting on your own experiences there. So I really encourage people to go back and read through some of those posts and just look at some of the projects that you guys had put together and the tours that you guys had put together, because that's one of the reasons I really liked it, was because it was so well-rounded and has at least you guys try to give as complete of a scope as you could to the experience of connecting with these places and connecting with these cultures. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think it's really, really wonderful. And I don't know, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about, I know I have my own words, but I'd love to hear it in your own words, why you decided to not just pick one thing, and how you decided you were going to try and tackle that task of encompassing all of these different parts of culture in your tours and your experiences, and at which point you felt like you had enough experience to no longer just be a watcher and actually be the person who provided that connection for other people. Because that's something that I think about a lot talking about agave spirits is, at what authority do I have to present these lovely spirits to people when, I just, 5 years with a company is nothing compared to 5 generations of making the spirit.
Yeah. So kind of 2 questions that you're presenting there. One is the last one. At what point do you feel like you have the authority, the knowledge, the grounding to be a spokesperson, to be a tour guide in my case, or to be an author? And the other question was, how did it go? It was choosing the subjects that I chose to make, as you described it, a well-rounded presentation of a place on earth, a well-rounded presentation of Oaxaca, right? Pottery, textiles, food, farming, etc. So I'll start with the first one. And, one of the things, and there's an alignment here with what you were speaking about in terms of mezcal, which is that mezcal is a product. It's the outcome of a long process and a deep history. And what we're left with that we can hold in our hands and easily talk about is that bottle of mezcal and the liquid inside. And I wrote a book about potters. I wrote a book about traditional dressways. And both of those would appear to focus on also a product, right? The clay, the garment. For me, all of these things have always just been a conversation piece. I'm sitting at a table here. On the table, there's a clay vessel. We put clay vessels on our tables or other pieces that inspire conversation around which we can start to meet, right? First, we talk about that clay vessel because we don't know what else to talk about. And then once we loosen up around that, we can talk about something deeper. So my tours are focused on, I should say, on pottery, on textiles, on food, because that's something that my culture can relate to. We can relate to these objects. We are curious about the human beings that make those objects, but not quite sure to approach them. That's certainly been my experience. And having something in common, the clay, the textiles, the cotton, the natural dyeing, the production of mezcal, is a bridge to connect me from the place I come from with you from the place you come from. And they're very different places. But for me, all of these things are symbols of old rooted culture, right? I mean, and so in my tours, we did a lot of textile tours because people in the United States were interested in textile tours. And I love the textiles because it's a symbol of a deep old culture. We did pottery tours, same reason, right? It's a symbol of a deep old culture. Mezcal tours, same kind of thing for me, right? It's like what I'm really interested in sharing here, what I was really interested in, continue to be interested in, is the humanity behind the things that we make. I love what we make with our hands. I love what we do, the skills, the craftsmanship, how we solve the problems of cooking something, or lightening our heads with mezcal by turning agave into something, right? I love those processes. But what I love even more is the humanity behind it. And that gets back to that sense of looking for rootedness. So in Traditions of Mexico, in that tour company, in the blogs that I wrote, in the photography that I do, what matters most to me is the story of the humanity that's part of that. The focus may appear to be textiles. It may appear to be pottery, and it is. But there, as I say, traditional clothing isn't anything but laundry if somebody's not wearing it. So it is humanity that gives it life, right? What's the point of mezcal if it's not made with all of this art and tradition, and if it's not drunk and enjoyed, right? So these are human stories. These are human stories. The object is secondary. The product is secondary. What gives me, at what point do I feel like I have the authority or the ground or the knowledge to share on any of these subjects? First of all, I feel like, and you're doing this as well, Francisco, and I think Mezcal Vago is doing this as well, which is that there's an important role for somebody like me who is not of a place, who is from another place, and understands the culture of a place I'm from, and then go and immerses himself in this new place. So in my case, from the United States, and immersing myself in Oaxaca to be a bridge. And you may hear this often, and it is true. The cultural bridge is an important one. The family has been distilling mezcal for 100 or 200 generations, or 100 or 200 years, or have been making pottery for 20 generations or 250 generations, knows their art deeply and well. But they may not have any idea how to communicate about that to somebody that comes from the context that I come from. And somebody who comes from the context I come from and goes and learns about that stuff then becomes a storyteller, a bridge between the two. I find that to be an important role. One of the things that I really enjoyed seeing on my tours was people having a similar experience to the one I had when I first went to southern Mexico, which is that it opened their eyes, right? And my tours were filled with people from the United States, by and large, and some Canadians, some Australians, but a lot of people from the United States who grew up with some degree or another of similar stereotypes about Mexico to those that I grew up with. So you can't hold on to those stereotypes if you go and you spend time in southern Mexico. It's impossible, right? So to bring people into an experience, translate that experience for them, which is very important. What you're seeing here, let me explain to you what you're seeing, because your eyes don't have a way to understand the layout of this village and why people are all dressed the same way, or why everybody in this village makes pottery that looks the same. We don't have a context for that here in the United States anymore. So you explain that. You explain how family circles work. You explain how working in the fields work. You explain how the generational ejido system works, and so on and so forth. And it opens our minds. It educates us. So I think of my position or your position as being educators. And first we were students, and of course we continue to be students. But at a certain point, you've learned enough that you're able to share it with somebody who hasn't learned that bit yet, right? So maybe that's when you have the authority. It's like, well, I've learned something. I have a sense of understanding it, and I think you might find it interesting. And if you share that with somebody and they find it interesting, then you're right. And if they don't find it interesting, then you're wrong about it, right? It's like, go back to school.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the idea that, you know, the ceramic or the textile or whatever topic you're focusing on for that particular conversation is secondary, right? Because a lot of the people that I have on this program, it's not often that I get to speak with people that have kind of a similar or have similar experiences of being the role of having the role of the bridge between the two, right? You know, for example, I've had, you know, brand owners that I've had on are usually people who have a multi-generational connection to the people, to the location that their brand is based, right? There's not a lot of people who I think have my role that have such a strong connection with a particular brand. I'm very lucky for that. But you know, I've had conversations with a couple people in private that do have similar roles. One of them who comes to mind is my friend Missy Calcafin from Del Maguey, where we've had these conversations where, you know, we could be selling whatever. It doesn't really matter. You know, that's one of the reasons I think people think that I'm not as interested. I think it surprises people when we talk about mezcal, they get the impression that I might not be as interested in mezcal itself, because frankly, for me, the underlying foundation of the culture and the people is the reason that I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I have such a fascination with these places and these regions and these locations, the physical world or the environment around them, right? The biological world, the diversity that's going on at the ground level. That's why I love doing this. It isn't particularly because it's mezcal. It's because it's a window into everything else that makes up that mezcal, right? So that I'm so glad to hear you say that it's secondary, because I feel the exact same way. It's really about the things that are underlying it that produce that particular ceramic, that produce that mezcal, that produce that textile, what have you, or that, you know, the influences that produce that particular dish, right? That's what I find fascinating and really creates such a strong connection for me personally. And I don't know, it's really it's validating to hear somebody else have that same kind of perspective. You know, talking about
just to interrupt a second, I think that in the culture that we come from, which is by and large a material culture, it's easier to focus on an object.
Yeah.
The human story behind it. And we also, most of us, not all of us, but most of us don't come from circumstances in which there are rich human stories behind the objects that we use. You know, that connection was lost a long time ago. And that's, you know, and I'm painting with a broad brush because there's beautiful handmade artisanal storied things that come into our lives and that come out of this country that we live in, and then the story becomes fascinating, like who made this and why. You know, in this particular valley in Vermont, they've been growing a certain kind of, I don't know, I'm making this up, but clover that makes a certain kind of honey that's been in the family for multiple generations, right? But that's rare. That's rare in the United States, and in southern Mexico, it's until, you know, 50 years ago was absolutely the norm, and it would have been the norm here a century or two ago. So we've lost that. We are much more material. We focus on objects, and it's easier to focus on an object, right, than it is to focus on the human culture behind it, because the human culture is the way people live, what they do is, it's messy stuff. It's all over the place. But it is, you know, but it is what we are, right? We are living human beings. And so it's a lot easier to talk about a pot than it is to talk about the story of the potters. But it's much more enriching to start digging into the story of those potters, you know? And so to make that leap from the object to the humanity that creates it, right? And then that's where you start touching this. That's where, you know, so I think we relate around that. It's like, oh, there's something that's so heartfelt and soulful about all that is behind the creation of whatever the thing may be, right? The thing is so secondary.
You know, and one of the things you also said that kind of you know, perked my ears up a little bit, and something that I've run into and come across in my time when we're bringing people, or when people come down, I'm taking them to the palenques and stuff, is, you know, you talk about being a bridge for people, not necessarily just through language, but also in kind of perspectives and ways of thinking, right? Like, you know, in mezcal, it's always like, oh, well, I'm trying to think of a particular example. Of course, now my brain is failing to think of one, which is kind of a classic situation. But there's very like, you know, bartenders, for example, get very, as much as I hate this word, geeky about details and the science behind things, right? And they're like, well, why do you do things this particular way? Why do you do things this particular way? And because that's just the you know, again, kind of getting lost, or not necessarily lost, but just given their own perspectives and their own background, focusing on a type of minutia that these producers might not necessarily focus on themselves, right? And for me, that was always a big challenge. Was there were so many questions that people visiting would ask, and I would ask, and the answer was always, well, that's just the way we do it.
Yes.
You know, it's something that has just been not necessarily lost, but just it's something that's just taken as completely understood as how you do this particular thing. Right. And they just, you know, trying to bridge that was always kind of a big challenge for me, to kind of continue asking a question 3 or 4 different times in 3 or 4 different ways, so that you would get at least enough of an accurate answer that provided enough information to at least satisfy the person that was trying to ask that question. And I'm assuming you kind of ran into similar things when you guys were doing your
all the time. I mean, I love that you bring that up, because those questions, my experience completely parallel to yours. And I'm a tour guide, so I'm translating a world to people again and again and again. And first, I was the one asking those questions as a young man, you know, because we bring our cultural perspective to it. So those questions became my favorite questions to answer, because it's the question that really begins to illustrate the difference about how this culture that we don't quite understand approaches things, and our culture approaches things. So, for example, in the world of ceramics, a classic question that I would get from people on my pottery-related tours is, why don't they sign their pots? And that question opens up this whole opportunity to explain to people a difference of approaches. So if you're from the United States and you do ceramics, or you create anything else, of course, we're going to sign it. And if we do ceramics here, it's usually a personal expression, and we're doing branding on it because, you know, I made this pot, I'm selling this pot, it's an Eric Mindling pot. I'm recognized as Eric Mindling who does this pot. And you know, my income is based on that recognition. Plus, I'm attached to it because it's an expression, an artistic expression of, you know, some element of my personal experience of being alive is the way I made this pot, you know. Here's a case in point. This is a pot from a potter around here. She signed it very simply, but it says RW on the bottom. So Oaxacan potters, you know, there are some exceptions now, but traditionally they don't sign their pots. They would never think of signing their pots. They make pots because it's a trade. They make pots because they're making pots so people can cook food. They make pots the way their mother made them, the way their grandmother made them, the way their great-grandmother made them. It's not about personal expression. It's about producing something that's needed. I'd say it's like if you were a barrel maker, you wouldn't necessarily sign your barrels 100 years ago. You're making something that's utilitarian and needed. And so just having that conversation with people illustrates the difference, which is a little bit of a mind bend because they're such finely made pots. There's so much skill that goes into them. There's so much ancestral knowledge, but there's no need to sign it. And, again and again and again, questions like that would come up. Another one would be, what is your favorite pot to make? That was a very common question that people would ask the potters, and the potters would be like, and the most common answer was the one that sells the best.
Yeah, right.
Or another question, which is, why are we making these pots? Yes, we do it because we enjoy it, but we're making them so that we can feed ourselves. I really like making the pots that sell the best, right? It's a completely different cultural approach to producing something. And that really stretches the way we think about maybe what we do, but also we get to understand something about this different culture we walked into. So I love those kinds of questions, Francisco. They're my favorite kinds. But at first, like, I don't know. I don't know why she doesn't sign it, right? It takes a while to figure that out. And the potter doesn't have an answer to you why she doesn't sign it. She doesn't say, I don't sign my pots because for me, it's a communal process that's collective. It's not about individual identity. She doesn't have those words, right? She does it, as they say, because this is how it's done.
And hearing you bring up that idea of why they don't sign it, and it just, again, like you said, I love the fact that it just reinforces the idea of generational communal knowledge, right? So how could you claim that this is yours necessarily when the work is yours? Of course, but the knowledge and the craft and the technique is something that has been honed over generations by several different families, by the families that make up that particular village or area,
Yeah.
or whatever geographic area you're talking about, right? On that note, I do have one question, and this is just my own piquing my own curiosity because you brought it up. You know, one of the few examples that I've noticed where people I've seen ceramics in Mexico signed is in the northern area around Mata Ortiz, which is its own kind of really cool story. But in Oaxaca, one of the few examples was actually the black clay mezcalero jugs that I've seen used a lot of times branded with some kind of mark or something. Do you know why that particular type of vessel was branded more than others?
That is a fantastic example. And it is the only example I know of let's say, 1980, where potters sign their pieces. And I have asked that question of the potters. You know, those potters are dead because they don't use those jugs in that way anymore. But, you know, if you've traveled in Mezcal, in the Mezcal world in Oaxaca, as you have, you see those beautiful old Mezcal jugs, the old Mezcaleros, with the gorgeous old signatures on them. And I have not had a satisfactory answer to it, but it was branding. It was that those men, and in this case, in Coyotepec, where it's men who do the pottery, which is very unusual in Mexico, but in indigenous Mexico, in that village, the men made the mezcaleros. The mezcaleros were very difficult pots to achieve because of the narrow mouth and how they had to dry. And they were very fine pots. And it may have been, and now I'm surmising, because I wasn't told this directly, that it was branding. It was a way of saying that Leonidas Barranco made this piece. He sold it in Miahuatlan. Somebody else in Miahuatlan sees it, wants to find it, and goes and tracks down Leonidas Barranco at the market in Miahuatlan or at the market in Oaxaca. But that's a very insufficient answer that I'm giving you. It's an incomplete answer. It's me trying to know something that I wish I did know. I've dug into it a lot, and when I'm in Coyotepec, I continue to dig into it, and it's far enough back that people don't know the answers. Because they stopped probably signing and making mezcaleros. Actually, it's not entirely true. They probably stopped making those in the 50s because then plastic and other things replaced the mezcaleros. So there are people alive who know that. Anyway, there you have it. I don't have the answer for you, but it's a great example. And it's the only example that I've seen, pre-1980s of people signing those pots. And they're gorgeous. Those pieces are so gorgeous.
This is the particular jug that we're talking about, is the mezcalero jug here, which is, it's got a particular shape that's designed for, being upright and pouring mezcal and preventing evaporation and whatnot. And you can see here where it's actually signed, this is what we're talking about, which is usually kind of up around, oh, my wrong page, up around this neck area here that they usually tend to sign them, at least that I've seen. Yeah, just a really interesting example of kind of an exception of one particular style that I just wanted to bring up. Because the jugs are fascinating, they're wonderful, they're awesome. We've experimented with we're very lucky in that we have some 100-year-old vessels from one of the kind of the patriarch of Vago, Acalino, his family jugs that we keep at our office, and we've experimented with aging some mezcal with mostly good, some not so good, mixed results, but overarching theme is that it usually tends to produce some really interesting, really wonderful mezcal. But that was just one particular example. I did want to ask you kind of one of the questions that is a little bit of a topic of at least, a topic that comes up from time to time in our conversation, in my conversations with people who have traveled throughout Mexico and spent a lot of time there. I have a really wonderful friend who runs a Mezcal program in Tucson, Arizona, who did a lot of doctoral work working with rural coffee producers, and he spent a lot of time in Guerrero. And we've talked a little bit about kind of the idea of overexposure and access to producers and kind of, I don't know, just people having almost too much access to people and again, overexposure to where these people sometimes sense of autonomy as human beings to have their own space, right? Because in the Mezcal world, everything's all about transparency, right? So I see a lot of in the message boards and stuff like that, people talking about producers that they visited, and then people get upset because they posted like a producer's house or something like that. It can get very, very contentious very, very quickly, right? So I'm wondering if you ever thought about kind of how you guys balance giving people access to people and preventing them from being attractions and really just maintaining kind of their own humanity, you know, because it's something that I'm always very interested in, particularly people who have roles similar to ours, providing access for other people to other people. It's a very weird concept if you go down, if you think about it to a certain extent. So I'm just really curious if you ever thought about that, what your perspective is, and how you guys handle that as a tour company, and also as a photographer, which is also obviously something that is a topic that comes up very often in photography.
It's I think about it all the time, Francisco, and I have from sort of day one. And you know, I mean, it's doctoral thesis stuff here, and there's so much, you know, there's no black and white to this. Is this good? Is this bad? Should it? Shouldn't it? Yeah, I work with, as you do, I work with artisans. I work with traditional artisans who, on the most part, are losing their life ways, losing their things have changed so much in Mexico over the last century and in the world that what traditional people produce has lost much of its local market. This isn't true for Mezcal. Mezcal is just getting to expand its market. We were still drinking Mezcal like crazy, even when other liquors came into Oaxaca in the 90s and the thousands. But for pottery and textiles, that's not true. I have watched traditional pottery slowly disappear in the 25 years that I've been in Oaxaca. The same is true for traditional textiles. The same is true for traditional farming, traditional cooking ways, food, languages, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, it's all losing its presence in places like Oaxaca because something else is being offered from the industrial world, from the Western world. And, you know, there are pros and cons to what's being offered. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I highly value, as do the rural people who make a living from it, what they create and the lifestyle that it affords them to be able to stay home and make pots, to be able to stay home and spin cotton and weave. The health benefits that are derived from eating the food that you traditionally ate. So I say all of this to say that there is no perfect way to walk out into the world and not leave footprints and not leave behind a wake, you know, to not have one impact or another. There is, however, as I see it in the work I do, that I've done with tourism, that I do with writing, that I do with photography, there is a higher value in highlighting, celebrating, recognizing, and identifying the cultures, the people, and the arts that they create. And the reason that there's a higher value in that, in my mind, is that if you can't sell your pottery locally anymore, you either stop selling pottery and you migrate, which is a very common story, to Mexico City or to Los Angeles, because there's no livelihood left for you in the community, or you find a new market for your pottery, or your textiles, or your, you know, what have you. And that new market in this particular era of history has been Mexican middle class, and it has been tourism, and it has been tourists, and it has been export. And to have access to all of those things means that you need to access all of those things: Mexican middle class, tourism, tourists, and a foreign market. So that creates a place where there is an important role for connectors, and this has been true throughout history. It's like, who brings two pieces together? And again, now we're coming back to this bridge. So I see a higher good being created by creating exposure, by people coming and visiting up to a certain point, by writing about, by saying, in this village they do this, go there. You'll see in the pottery book that I created, in the textile book, it was very important for me in each of those books to have maps, and the maps indicate where all those communities are. Those communities want people to come and visit. Those communities are looking for a way to create income from what they're doing, and they're not finding it in the old way. And so if we go and visit and we purchase something, or we go and visit and we share their story. I send journalists out to different communities. I tell stories about them. It creates, it's a certain kind of organic marketing. And I think the impact of that is more positive than negative, and by a reasonable degree. But it's an imperfect world. There are a lot of gray zones. There's an example in Oaxaca. I'm thinking of, what we might call over tourism. And Oaxaca has been getting more and more and more and more and more tourism. And there are all sorts of impacts from that. It's all over the place. I think of a village called Teotitlan del Valle. And if y'all have been, any of you have been to Oaxaca, probably know Teotitlan. It's famous. It's right outside of Oaxaca. It's famous for making these beautiful woolen tapestry rugs. And that village has done very well financially from creating those tapestries and selling those tapestries. And it's close enough to Oaxaca City that it gets tourists all the time. Interesting thing about Teotitlan is that there are households that you will visit in Teotitlan that get tour buses, or pre-COVID got tour buses once or twice or three times a day. And you go into those households and you feel like this place has had too many people come through it. And the people have gone into sort of this just show mode, right? They've just had to put on a facade to deal with so many visitors. But those houses are the exception. They've done very well financially. I think they've paid a certain price. And then in most of the rest of the village, what you get is human connection. And you see a place where the culture is very much alive, right? It's not like money came in, we stopped doing what we were doing to be something else. It's like money came in, we've done well by it, we get to do what we're doing with more elegance. So Teotitlan is an interesting example because it's one of the places that has had the most impact, an indigenous village that has the most impact from tourism, that's had the most financial gain from tourism, and that still holds on to a whole lot of its identity, and it's a traditional Zapotec village with all sorts of different rituals that it carries out. So that's one example, and that's an example that I look at as a very positive example. In Traditions Mexico, I never wanted to bring heaps of tourists to anybody's house, and I wouldn't want heaps of visitors coming to my house either. Most of the places that we took people were places that we would visit 2 or 3 times a year, because most of the places were way out there, probably like the remote stills that you work with. It's hard to get there. There aren't easy places to stay there. Other people don't go there. I liked going off the beaten path because there's so much wonder to see out beyond sort of, the first row of attractions in a place like Southern Mexico. And those people also have less access to the benefits of having visitors come around. So we'd visit once, twice, 3 times a year, many of the places we went to. And they loved having us come and visit because it meant having a novelty in your day. It meant having these Americans come into your house. It meant the potential for income, and it meant having the recognition that these fascinated people brought to you. So there was always a welcome there. And I feel like, to the extent that I can know it, because I'm not from that village, I don't stay in the village after I leave it, obviously, to see what happens after we leave that household. To the extent that I understand it, what we brought, what the visitation brought, was by and large good and by and large welcome. And that's probably true on the most part in most of the places that I am familiar with. Now, broad brush, there's also, there's disrespectful tourism. There's going in and not understanding what you're seeing. There is leaving your garbage behind. There's garbage in different senses than the actual one. So it's a thick topic. It's a complex one. It's one, again, that I think about all the time. And I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't feel from the center of my heart that sharing and storytelling wasn't beneficial. I think it is. I think the sharing and storytelling that I do would have had no meaning and no need to exist a century ago, because traditional people didn't need anybody from the outside doing anything, because local economies were healthy, because things were working in a way that they had developed working over the centuries. But that's all come apart. And that's come apart by and large because of the impacts of the Western society that I'm from. And so on the one hand, this Western society is a poison to old ways of doing and being. And on the other side, it has certain medicines to offer in this particular time in history, right? And respectful storytelling that recognizes and opens people's eyes to what's wonderful about this or that place in humanity creates understanding. It creates empathy. It creates appreciation. And I think there's a very high value in that.
You know, I see that perspective, I think, and I think I see your whole kind of respect, and I don't know, not, you know, forgive the pun, but I see your lens imprinted on your photography, and that's one of the things I really love about it, is because it gives your portraiture, for me personally, you know, I am very much an amateur photographer. I like taking pictures. I do it a lot when I'm in Mexico. I follow a lot of people and follow their work. And, you know, one of the things that I talk a lot about people is kind of the over fetishization of like, you know, cracked hands and cracked feet and the things that are resultant of a very hard life in poverty that people seem to want to focus on to a certain extent, right? But your photography, I love it because it gives such a whole complete picture of people as a complete person, and you really see them for that entire whole identity, both in the micro, in the context of like them being themselves, right, and then in the macro of the broader culture through your appreciation for textiles and the things that make up that regional culture wherever you happen to be. That's always one of my favorite particular things about your work. I highly encourage people, we only have about 5 minutes left. I highly encourage people to, and I'll let you talk about this in just a moment if you would, please, just tell us kind of where, you know, what you're working on, how people can follow it. Before that, though, I do have one question which kind of ties into that. Somebody from YouTube was asking why you left Oaxaca. I think we kind of covered that just with COVID and tradition shutting down. But they're wondering why you chose Santa Fe as where you're living. And I think that would be a wonderful segue into kind of what you're working on now and how people can follow you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I left Oaxaca. There's more to it. Actually, it preceded COVID. I have not lived in Oaxaca for 3 years as my full-time base. And I left it in, I'll make this short, it's a longer story, but basically Oaxaca gave me a tremendous amount. The gifts that were bestowed upon me in knowledge and experience from traditional rural people, the learnings that I had from that have made so much of my life rich. And in the process of creating both of the books I created, the pottery book and the textile book, that was my opportunity to return the gift. Right? That book is a way of taking knowledge, condensing it, and then giving it back to the world, giving it back to the people of Oaxaca, the people of Mexico, and the world beyond that. And after I had finished the book on the Oaxacan textiles, I think it was 2016, I felt inside of me an energetic balance. What I have been given, I have now been able to reciprocate. And in Oaxaca, we use a word called tequio, where you give something back for what you receive. And then I felt like it was time to leave Oaxaca, that I had done what I needed to do in Oaxaca. Not that I knew that I needed to do something, but I had gone, I had learned, and I was able to contribute and return it. And that's really when I left Oaxaca. I continued to run the tourism business, but then I was living in the States. The short version of why I moved to Santa Fe, because it's a convoluted story, but if there's any place in the States that I can think of living that feels like Oaxaca, northern New Mexico is that place. And I've known this. I've come through northern New Mexico, you know, through different chapters of my life. And this is also a place where the city of Santa Fe and northern New Mexico in general, there are a lot of artists and there are a lot of creatives and there are a lot of people who understand and appreciate and resonate with more rooted culture. And I thought, well, this is where I need to be. Sorry. Did that cut out? A call just came in from Scam Likely. So I felt like if I'm going to be in the States now, this is where I want to be. And with the end of Traditions Mexico, photography and portraiture around the cultures of Mexico, the old rooted cultures, and probably of Latin America is the direction I'm heading. This feels like the best base for me to be. I can speak Spanish here every day if I want to. I run into people all the time who I don't have to give the backstory on. They get it. They understand what I'm presenting. So it saves me a lot of breath. And it's beautiful here.
It is indeed. Like I said, growing up in the Southwest, Santa Fe was a frequent stop. So it is wonderful. If you haven't been, I highly encourage people. I'm going to go out on one note. We have Marv Burlin on YouTube who's watching, who says that he were their Padre de Mezcal when they got married in Teotihuacan about 10 years ago, and today is their anniversary. So we certainly wish them a
Marvin's been a wonderful traveler and friend for years, and we put mezcal down their gullets at their wedding, and it made for a good time. As you all know.
Eric, thank you so much. We are out of time this afternoon, man. This conversation was even better than I would have wished. We will link. We tagged him on our social media earlier. We will do so again, so you guys can follow Eric's work, his photography, his projects in Santa Fe down the road. Thanks again, my friend. Please take care of yourself.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Francisco, and thank you all for listening. Take care.
Have a wonderful afternoon, bud.